The evening the mercury plummeted to 12 degrees below zero, Lily pressed her trembling fingertips against the jagged patterns of frost colonizing the interior of the windowpane. Her breath came in shallow, visible puffs as she turned to her father, her voice a fragile thread in the biting air. "We are going to freeze to death in this place, Dad," she whispered. Caleb Mercer looked at his daughter, her small frame swallowed by a coat that wasn't thick enough, and he nearly let the mask slip. He almost confessed the harrowing truth, that he hadn't gambled his final $3 on this dilapidated, skeletal cabin merely to seek shelter from the winter. He had bought it because he knew that somewhere within these rotting walls lay a secret that terrified men of immense power. The path to this frozen threshold had begun 90 days prior, in the stifling, crowded atmosphere of a county auction in Mill Haven. It was a town where the ghosts of industry haunted the streets and the air tasted of rust. Caleb had stood at the back of the room, a silent spectator to the feeding frenzy. He watched as slick real estate moguls and aggressive investors pounced on foreclosed properties, snatching up lives and legacies with the flick of a pen. Meanwhile, Caleb reached into his pocket, his fingers tracing the few coins remaining. He counted them not as currency, but as the final seconds of a countdown to total oblivion. There was a time, not so long ago, when Caleb Mercer walked with the confident stride of a respected professional. As a senior civil engineer, he possessed a stable career, a sterling reputation, and a future that seemed written in stone. But the foundations of that life had been poured on sand. When the massive engineering firm that employed him became entangled in a sprawling corruption web, Caleb had been the lone voice of dissent. He refused to authenticate fraudulent safety reports or sign off on substandard materials. In the brutal world of corporate survival, his integrity made him the perfect fall guy. He wasn't jailed, there wasn't enough evidence for that, but he was systematically dismantled. The ensuing legal battles acted like a predatory parasite, draining his savings until the well ran dry. The bank, indifferent to his innocence, repossessed his family home. The stress and the sudden descent into poverty acted as a wedge, eventually driving his wife away. Burnt out by the relentless grind of uncertainty, Caleb had been left with nothing but a vague promise to himself that he would figure things out when the dust settled. But the dust never settled, it only thickened. All that remained of his world was his 10-year-old daughter, Lily, and the $3 he had managed to squirrel away from the desperate sale of his professional tools. When the auctioneer reached lot 17, the room grew quiet with a sort of mocking curiosity. The listing was grim: Ridge View parcel, 5 acres, structure condemned, utilities severed, and a mountain of back taxes looming over it. To clear the county's books, the minimum bid was lowered to a pittance. Before the cold knot of fear in his stomach could paralyze him, Caleb raised his hand. $3, he croaked. A wave of derisive laughter rippled through the gallery. A man in a bespoke wool coat leaned toward his associate, his voice dripping with condescension. "Look at that," he sneered. The man just purchased a coffin with a roof. Caleb didn't blink. He didn't look away. He ignored the mockery because his eyes had caught a detail in the fine print of the auction ledger that everyone else had overlooked. The name of the original deed holder was Arthur Mercer, his grandfather. Arthur was a phantom in the Mercer family tree, a man whose name was rarely spoken and whose history had been scrubbed clean. Decades earlier, Arthur had been a titan of industry, the head of a soaring construction conglomerate, only to walk away from it all under a cloud of mystery and whispered scandal. The trek to Ridge View was a grueling 40-minute ascent up a logging road that time had forgotten. The asphalt was a memory, replaced by cracked earth and deep ruts where the encroaching forest stood like a phalanx of silent, watchful sentinels. Lily sat in the passenger seat of their battered, aging sedan. At first, she was merely quiet, staring out at the passing trees, but as the last vestiges of civilization flickered and died behind them, her silence turned to a restless, vibrating anxiety. When the cabin finally emerged from the shadows of the skeletal, towering pines, Caleb felt his own heart sink. It was less a home and more a monument to decay. The entire structure had developed a weary lean, as if tired of fighting gravity. The roof sagged under the weight of years, and plywood boards were nailed haphazardly over most of the windows like bandages on a terminal patient. The stone chimney was fractured near the crown, a jagged split threatening to bring the whole column down. "Dad," Lily's voice was barely audible, trembling with the realization of their predicament. "We really are going to freeze here." Caleb killed the engine. The silence that rushed in was heavy and cold. He stared at the threshold of the man his family had tried to forget. "Not if I'm right about this place, Lily," he said, more to convince himself than her. Stepping inside was like walking into a time capsule. The interior air was thick with the scent of ancient timber and the musk of forgotten decades. Pale lances of afternoon light pierced the gaps in the window boards, illuminating dancing motifs of dust. The center of the main room was dominated by a massive fireplace, its stones hand-laid with a precision that defied the surrounding rot. In the corner, a cast-iron stove stood like a rusted guardian. As they walked, the floorboards groaned in protest, singing a song of neglect. Lily pulled her coat tight against her chest, her eyes wide as she surveyed the gloom. "It's all broken, Dad." Caleb dropped to his knees, his hands searching the grain of a massive support beam. He traced the joinery, his engineer's eye spotting the hidden quality. "It's not broken, honey," he whispered. "It's just waiting." They spent the remainder of the afternoon in a feverish race against the setting sun. They hauled out piles of debris, swept away the mummified remains of mouse nests, and pried enough boards from the windows to reclaim the space from the shadows. Caleb's inspection became more intense as he worked. He examined the foundation with a surgeon's focus, noting the use of old-growth timber and precision dovetail joints. This wasn't a shack thrown together by a hermit, it was a masterclass in structural integrity. Whoever had built this had invested their soul into the parts that mattered most, the bones. As the sun dipped below the jagged horizon, the temperature plummeted with predatory speed. Caleb labored over the chimney, clearing enough blockage to risk a fire. When he finally struck the match, the flames hesitated, flickering weakly against the cold draft, before finally roaring to life. The hearth began to radiate a steady, pulsing warmth. Lily unrolled their thin sleeping bags as close to the heat as she dared, her eyes tracking the shadows as they danced across the rafters. "Why did Grandpa Arthur come all the way out here to live like this?" she asked softly, her face illuminated by the orange glow. Caleb paused, his shadow stretching long against the wall. "Because sometimes, Lily, doing what is right costs you everything you have." Long after Lily's breathing had slowed into the steady rhythm of sleep, Caleb pulled the tattered, yellowing deed from his pocket. He stared at the name, Arthur Mercer. Arthur had been the founder of the Mercer and Hale Structural Group. That entity had eventually been absorbed into Hale Global Infrastructure, which had grown into a leviathan, a primary government contractor with its reach in every corner of the nation's infrastructure. The history books claimed Arthur had simply retired and faded into a quiet, obscure death. But Caleb knew better. He remembered the whispers he'd found when his own career began to unravel. Rumors that Arthur had vanished after blowing the whistle on a series of dangerously rushed bridge contracts. The similarities between their lives were not just coincidental, they were a roadmap. The following morning, the harsh winter light revealed the cabin's secrets with newfound clarity. Caleb noticed that the stones of the fireplace weren't just stacked, they formed a very specific geometric sequence. To a layman, it was decorative. To a structural engineer, it was a load distribution map. The walls, too, were deceptive. They weren't just simple planks but were reinforced with a sophisticated system of hidden cross-bracing that was unheard of in a wilderness cabin. The breakthrough came when Lily tripped over a slightly raised floorboard near the rear of the cabin. The sound it made wasn't a dull thud, but a hollow, metallic ring. Caleb's pulse quickened. Together, they pried the heavy timber back, revealing a narrow, zinc-lined box designed to withstand moisture and time. Inside, they found rolls of parchment wrapped in heavy oilcloth and a leather-bound journal that creaked as Caleb opened it. His hands shook as he unfurled the first blueprint. It wasn't a plan for a house. It was a modular suspension bridge system, an elegant, revolutionary design that was light years ahead of anything Hale Global was currently using. He flipped through pages of exhaustive calculations, rigorous stress test results, and lists of material substitutions that could slash costs without sacrificing a single ounce of safety. Caleb's breath caught in his throat. This was the treasure Arthur had protected. This was the reason a titan of industry had been erased from history. The journal provided the missing pieces. Arthur had documented a series of internal memos proving that company executives had knowingly used inferior steel and compromised concrete to pad their profit margins. When Arthur refused to sign the safety certifications, they didn't just fire him, they threatened to destroy him. If you are reading this, one entry began in his grandfather's firm, slanted script, then you understand that your integrity is worth more than your comfort. This cabin is not a place of exile. It is an insurance policy. Caleb closed the book, his mind racing. Insurance against what? A low, rhythmic thrumming from outside broke his concentration. He moved to the window and pulled back a sliver of the remaining shutter. At the edge of the clearing sat a black SUV. It was idling, its exhaust pluming into the frozen air like a ghost. The windows were opaque, dark as midnight, and the vehicle sat there with a menacing patience. It hadn't been there an hour ago. Lily moved to his side, her voice a terrified whisper. "Do you know who that is?" Caleb's eyes locked onto the silver emblem on the SUV's grille. "It's Hale Global," he said, his voice turning cold. They had been watching the property records. They knew the Mercer name had returned to the deed, or perhaps they had never stopped watching this patch of woods at all. He carefully refolded the blueprints and placed them back in the protective box. He looked at his daughter, seeing her fear, but also seeing the fire reflected in her eyes. "We aren't freezing here, Lily," he said, his voice regaining a strength he thought he'd lost forever. "We are exactly where we are supposed to be." Outside, the SUV remained a silent, idling threat. Inside, the fire burned with a renewed ferocity. For the first time since his life had been dismantled, Caleb Mercer didn't feel like a victim. He felt a surge of righteous purpose. By the fourth night, the psychological warfare intensified. The SUV no longer lurked in the shadows, it sat boldly at the bend of the road, its high-beam headlights slicing through the falling snow and raking across the cabin walls. Lily stood by the hearth, her voice trembling again. "Dad, they're still watching us. They aren't going away." Caleb knew the pressure was mounting. The cold was a physical weight now, pressing against the cabin walls and finding every microscopic crack. But the heat of the discovery was more powerful. He had found more than just blueprints, he had found the memos Arthur had hidden behind a loose stone in the hearth, direct evidence of criminal negligence that dated back 40 years. He understood now why a multi-billion-dollar corporation was obsessed with a rotting shack in the woods. They didn't want the land. They wanted to burn the evidence of their original sins. The next afternoon, the stalemate broke. The SUV crunched up the driveway and came to a halt inches from the porch. Two men emerged, their expensive wool overcoats and polished shoes looking absurdly out of place in the rugged wilderness. "Mr. Mercer," the taller man said, his voice smooth and rehearsed. He spoke as if he were in a boardroom rather than a snowy clearing. "I represent Hale Global. We are prepared to offer you a very generous compensation package for this property. There are historical complications with this site that the company wishes to resolve." He quoted a figure, a staggering amount of money. It was enough to buy a luxury apartment in the city, a new car, a wardrobe of warm clothes, and a decade of stability. For a heartbeat, Caleb looked at Lily and imagined a life where they weren't shivering. Then he remembered his grandfather's words, "Integrity is worth more than comfort." "The property is not for sale," Caleb said, his voice like iron. The man's professional smile didn't just fade, it evaporated. "Winter in these mountains is unforgiving, Caleb. Accidents happen in such isolated places. It would be a tragedy if something happened to you or your daughter." The threat hung in the frozen air long after the SUV had retreated back down the mountain. That night, as the wind howled and rattled the window frames like a living thing, Lily sat pressed against Caleb's side. "Are we going to be okay?" she asked. Caleb looked at her, choosing his words with care. "They are afraid, Lily. And when powerful people get scared, they try to buy or bully their way into silence. We aren't going to let them." The following morning, while Caleb was reinforcing the rear wall against the wind, he noticed something new. There were faint, etched markings on one of the primary support beams. He wiped away the grime and saw measurements that corresponded perfectly with the modular bridge design in the blueprints. He realized then that the cabin itself wasn't just a home, it was a prototype. It was a scaled, structural model designed to prove that Arthur's system could withstand immense pressure. Arthur hadn't fled to the woods to hide from the world, he had come here to build a fortress of proof. That realization changed the gravity of the situation. If Hale Global had buried this design to protect their profits, and if they had silenced Arthur before he could go public, then Caleb was holding a dead man's smoking gun. Around noon, a battered old pickup truck labored up the icy incline. The driver was a man named Walter Boone, a local with a beard the color of slate and hands as rough as bark. "I remember your grandfather," Walter said, offering a grip that felt like a vice. "Arthur was the finest builder this county ever saw. He used to tell me he was fighting off wolves in the woods and suits in the city." Caleb showed Walter a single page of the schematics, just enough to verify the legacy. Walter's face darkened as he studied the lines. "After the Eastover Bridge went down in '78, I stopped trusting a word that company said," Walter spat. "They blamed the welders, but Arthur, he told me the steel was garbage from the moment it left the mill." The final pieces of the puzzle locked into place. Hale Global's entire empire was built on a foundation of concealed failures and structural lies that went back half a century. As Walter left, he promised to reach out to a few people who still had a conscience. As evening fell, the snow began to descend in thick, heavy curtains. The SUV returned, parking closer than ever, its engine a low, predatory growl in the darkness. Lily stood at the window, her fear replaced by a strange, quiet resolve. "We're staying, aren't we?" Caleb looked at the cabin, the reinforced beams, the hidden documents, the fire that refused to die, and felt a profound sense of belonging. "No," he said. "They don't want this place because it's falling apart. They want it because it's the only thing in this world that's still standing on the truth." The headlights remained fixed on the cabin as the snow swallowed the road, cutting them off from the world. But inside, the fire roared. Caleb realized that this winter was more than a survival trial. It was a test of how far a man would go to finish the work his ancestors had started. The blizzard struck with a vengeance before dawn, depositing 2 feet of snow and turning the logging road into an impassable white void. But Caleb had already set the wheels in motion. While the men in the SUV waited for the cold to break his spirit, Walter Boone returned. He hadn't come alone. He brought a reporter from the regional paper and a retired state inspector who had been haunted by the Eastover Bridge collapse for decades. Inside the cabin, by a fire that had nearly surrendered to the cold a dozen times, Caleb spread the truth across the rough wooden table. He laid out Arthur's journal, the Revolutionary Bridge schematics, and the memos that named the men who had traded lives for margins. The retired inspector's hands shook as he scanned the documents. "We always suspected," he whispered, his voice thick with regret. "But we never had the proof. This changes everything." By mid-afternoon, the evidence had been documented. Photos were taken, and the files were scanned and transmitted from a high-gain signal in town. Within 48 hours, the story didn't just break, it exploded. It wasn't presented as a theory, but as a documented exposé of 50 years of corporate corruption. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic for the company. Hale Global's initial denials were drowned out by the weight of the evidence. Emergency board meetings were followed by the abrupt resignations of top-tier executives. The state government announced a formal reopening of the Eastover investigation, and federal regulators began a systemic review of every contract the company held. The black SUV never returned. A week later, a different kind of vehicle made its way up the mountain, a mail carrier with an official-looking envelope. It wasn't a threat or an offer. It was a legal notice placing a protective claim on Arthur Mercer's original patents pending a full federal review. Caleb stood on the porch, the cold air no longer feeling like an enemy. Lily stood beside him, her face bright. "Are we still going to freeze here, Dad?" He looked at the cabin, still weathered, still leaning, but unyielding. He shook his head. "No, Lily. We're going to rebuild this place." The world began to knock on their door. A major university's engineering department reached out, eager to study Arthur's modular suspension design. Grants were proposed, and high-level legal aid was offered to clear Caleb's name. What had started as a desperate $3 gamble was transforming into a legacy. That night, the fire burned with a brilliance they hadn't seen before. The wind still howled, but it no longer felt like a threat. Lily curled up next to Caleb, her voice a sleepy murmur. "Grandpa would be proud, wouldn't he?" Caleb stared into the embers, imagining the man who had sacrificed his life to build this sanctuary of truth. "He didn't lose his world, Lily," Caleb said softly. "He just hid it until he knew we'd be strong enough to find it." Outside, the moon turned the snow-covered forest into a landscape of silver. The abandoned cabin, once the butt of a joke at a county auction, stood as a silent, powerful testament. Sometimes, the man with the least is the only one who can afford the truth. If you enjoyed this story, you can show your love and support by subscribing to the Kindness Hour channel, liking, and sharing this video. And if you'd like to see your name featured at the top of our next story, drop your name and country in the comments below.